They called him the old professor. Behind those glasses, you expected a calm, thoughtful scholar. Instead, you got the most feared man in NHL history. On the worst nights, he would slam his own head against the glass partition in pure frustration. 8 Stanley Cups in 13 seasons. 5 consecutive championships from 1956 to 1960, a record no coach has touched since. Jean Beliveau, a man who won 11 cups himself, once said, "You could respect him, but you never truly stopped being afraid of him." So what made Toe Blake so terrifying that legends still speak his name with unease? Let's find out. In the spring of 1961, the Montreal Canadiens were locked in a brutal playoff semifinal against the Chicago Blackhawks. Tensions were already sky-high when referee Dalton MacArthur made a call that Blake considered a blatant injustice, an interference penalty that he believed cost his team the moment. What happened next stunned everyone in the building. Blake abandoned every trace of his composed, professorial image. He did not simply shout from the bench. He charged straight onto the ice in the middle of a live playoff game and threw a hard right-handed punch directly at MacArthur's face. Blake later admitted the punch grazed rather than landed cleanly, but his intent was never in question. NHL President Clarence Campbell handed Blake a $2,000 fine, the largest penalty of its kind at that time. But Blake was not finished. On his way to the locker room, he attempted to attack a fan in the corridor, then turned to the press and snarled, "I want to see if you have the guts to write exactly what happened out there." No apology, no remorse, only defiance. Reporters and opponents had long called him a vicious referee baiter, a label that sat awkwardly beside his intellectual nickname. But this moment made everything clear. Toe Blake was sending an unmistakable message to every official in the league. If you take a win from his team, there will be consequences. And he did not care what it cost him personally. On November 1st, 1959, Zach Plante took a puck to the face that tore open his skin and required 21 stitches. Before returning to the ice, he delivered an ultimatum to Blake. "I will not go back out there without my mask." The locker room tension was described by those present as absolutely explosive. Blake despised the idea. He belonged to an older generation that viewed protective equipment as a sign of weakness. He had previously mocked Plante with cutting sarcasm. "Those scars are souvenirs that money cannot buy." But with no capable backup goaltender available, Blake was forced into a corner. He reluctantly allowed Plante to wear the mask that night. However, Blake never truly surrendered. He told the press bluntly, "He won't keep wearing that thing." For months afterward, he watched Plante's every move with cold patience, waiting for a significant mistake that would give him a legitimate reason to demand the mask come off. It was a calculated psychological siege that turned Plante's own locker room into hostile territory. What made this episode uniquely terrifying was not Blake's anger. It was his patience. He lost the battle that November night, but he made sure Plante paid for the victory every single day that followed. Zach Plante went on to revolutionize goaltending, but he did it under constant fire from his own coach. Winning 5 consecutive Stanley Cups does not guarantee a relaxed locker room. Under Toe Blake, it guaranteed the opposite. Even at the peak of the Canadiens' dynasty, the atmosphere surrounding Blake never softened. Every hallway, every practice, every road trip carried the same invisible weight. Donnie Marshall, a player who won 5 consecutive Stanley Cups under Blake's command, captured this feeling with striking honesty. He recalled, "You could be walking down the hallway at the Montreal Forum and see Toe coming toward you. You would genuinely not know whether to say hello or just turn around and find another way to avoid him." That uncertainty was not accidental. Blake had no interest in being liked by his players. He wanted to be the one person they feared disappointing above all others. His silence was often more damaging than his outbursts, because silence meant he was measuring you and finding you lacking. Those who watched him on the bench described a man in permanent, controlled agitation. He paced constantly behind the coaching area like a caged animal. He chewed gum relentlessly. On the worst nights, he would slam his own head against the glass partition in frustration. Every movement communicated the same unbending standard. Anything less than 100% was a personal insult to him. His players did not just play for victory. They played to escape his judgment. If the hallway was uncomfortable, the locker room was a courtroom, and Blake was always the judge. He never softened his criticism behind closed doors. In fact, he preferred an audience. Public humiliation, delivered with surgical precision in front of teammates, was one of his most deliberate coaching weapons. After a poor performance, Blake would move slowly around the room, stopping directly in front of each player he had targeted. He would look them in the eye and dissect their mistakes with cold, unhurried cruelty. No shouting required, just facts delivered like a verdict. He carried every error in his memory and recalled them at the most damaging moments. A mistake made in January could resurface in April, right before a playoff game, delivered with the same fresh contempt as the night it happened. Dick Irvin Jr., the respected hockey broadcaster and historian, described Blake as ferocious, chippy, and intensely competitive, both on and off the ice. That competitiveness had no off switch. Yvonne Cornway, one of the most gifted players of that era, revealed just how far players went to manage Blake's reactions. If I let the other team score, I would look to see where he was standing on the bench and try to get off the ice through the door farthest from him, so he had time to cool down before I had to face him. Even champions needed an escape route. Blake understood that fear is not a single tool. It must be shaped differently for different people. For young players arriving in Montreal with something to prove, he used cold dismissal and biting sarcasm to test whether they had the mental toughness to survive his system. When asked whether Henri Richard, younger brother of the Rocket, could speak English, Blake replied without hesitation, "I don't even think he speaks French. I have never heard him open his mouth." The effect was lasting. Henri Richard was so intimidated by Blake that he signed his contracts without asking how much he would be paid. He later admitted, "I just signed and walked out. I did not even know what I was going to receive." But with the Rocket, a player whose fury was already legendary, Blake took the opposite approach. Rather than confronting him directly, he redirected that rage. You don't need to prove your courage with your fists. You prove it with Stanley Cups. Blake always knew exactly which door to open and which one to lock. The fear Blake created was not random. It produced results that border on the impossible. In 13 seasons coaching the Montreal Canadiens, he delivered 8 Stanley Cups. That is one championship every 1.6 years. His 5 consecutive titles from 1956 to 1960 remain untouched in NHL history to this day. His regular season winning percentage stood at .634. But under playoff pressure, when everything was on the line, that number climbed to .689. He won 18 of 23 playoff series, a series winning rate of .783. For comparison, Scotty Bowman eventually surpassed Blake's cup total with 9 championships, but needed 30 seasons to do it. Bowman himself openly acknowledged that he learned how to use fear as a tactical weapon directly from Blake. The numbers do not lie. Terror, applied correctly, wins. Blake's intimidation was never chaos. It was architecture. He understood that in a city where hockey was practically a religion, any loss of focus meant defeat. So he made himself the most frightening presence in the building, more frightening than any opponent. Red Fisher, the legendary Montreal hockey journalist who covered Blake for decades, described him as the embodiment of everything fierce, extreme, and driven. all funneled toward a single purpose: winning. Blake himself made his philosophy plain. The day I accept losing, I will retire on the spot. He did not build a dynasty through talent alone. He built it by making failure more terrifying than any opposing team could ever be. When Blake retired in 1968, immediately after delivering yet another Stanley Cup, the NHL lost something it has never fully replaced. Not just a great coach, but a presence larger than the league itself. Scotty Bowman learned from him. Zach Plante had to fight him. The Rocket had to be tamed by him. Henri Richard signed contracts without daring to ask his salary. Yvon Cornway mapped escape routes through locker room doors. Jean Beliveau called him an immovable force and never stopped being afraid of him. Every one of them, at the end of their careers, spoke his name the same way, with respect that could not quite be separated from fear. That was Toe Blake, the old professor, the most feared man ever to stand behind an NHL bench. Which NHL coach do you think comes closest to Blake's level of fear and dominance? Drop your answer in the comments below.